Welcome to Scriptures with Leon. Again, these are my thoughts and do not necessarily represent the beliefs of any church. We're about to go into Genesis chapter 5, but before we do, I want to just reflect on what we've been talking about. And you may have noticed that I'm encouraging you to practice divergent thinking. And divergent thinking in this case is an example of meditation and can result in the revelation of hidden truth. And I want you to understand that even though that I'm bringing these things up, I don't want you to think that this is all that you could find. There's more to these chapters than I'm telling you. We don't really have time to go into everything, and I'm going to forget things along the way. So what you need to do is keep meditating and pondering over the things that you read so that you can discover other things that God wants you to know. So to recap and expound on what we have already gone in chapter 4, I want you to remember that the atoning sacrifice, representing the sacrifice of Jesus, was known and looked forward to by them from Adam's time. And so the sacrifice, and the reason it was acceptable, was a sacrifice that required faith, just like the sacrifice of Jesus requires faith when we believe in it. And that's why Abel's sacrifice was accepted and Cain's wasn't. Now, we have established that Cain's fall was a more pronounced fall than the fall of Adam. So Adam's fall was a fall into mortality and into a probationary state where he could choose between good and evil. Now Cain's fall was having tasted of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil and choosing evil. And we see that the result and the thing that God warns him is going to happen is the loss, this huge loss that he's going to have. He's going to become equal with Satan instead of equal with Eve in the presiding sense. And so there's this huge loss, and there's so much behind what that means and what you can get out of that. And I really think that you need to study that and think about it. So, and then we see the contrast in the characters of Adam and Eve when they responded to having made a mistake or having disobeyed God and done something that they weren't supposed to do, versus Cain when he did something that he shouldn't have done, and how they responded to God. And there's this integrity difference that we are clearly able to see. Now, reminder that Abel yet lives, and so we saw that from chapter 4. His blood crying out from the ground, it stresses that he's still alive, and it also stresses that you cannot hide from the Lord. Now, a curse comes from the natural consequence of an action. We saw that. And it isn't God that curses. And similarly, we may ascertain that blessings can be naturally attained by actions prescribed by following the words of the Lord. So the Lord has set up this system that if we follow him, he's trying to help us. These blessings are going to come naturally by being obedient to what the Lord says. And we also note that the killing of others causes the one who kills to be the one who is wounded and not the person who is killed. So other things that I forgot to mention in chapter 4, Irad means runner, fugitive, city of witness, or wild donkey. I think it's important when we reflect on the names of the people that they were representative names, and so you can get information from it. And Enos means mortal man, sick, despaired of, and forgetful. And I thought that was interesting when it talked about in his time men began to call upon the name of the Lord, indicated, and you can think of things that what could that possibly mean? And one could be, hey, maybe it was a time of spiritual revival that they began to call upon the name of the Lord. So we look at his name and we see mortal man, sick, forgetful, despaired of. Maybe it could apply to these things. Maybe it was a time of spiritual revival. Maybe things were getting bad and they recognized they needed help. Maybe a few people started to die. There was more of an understanding that this life isn't a forever kind of a life. And maybe it's the Lord was as a parent, but I'm thinking in terms of two things that we see from the forgetful aspect of Enos's name, that maybe men were getting worse and worse. Maybe things were getting bad. And so there seems to be more of the letter B here in this case. Things are getting bad and they recognized they needed help. So going from there, we'll start with Genesis 5. First two verses, very interesting. It starts off, it reminds us, it goes back to the creation, and it gets back to the wording, and it says, Now this is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day God created him, in the likeness of God made he him. And he brings this up in verse 2, and then repeats this in verse 3, only under a different context. So when we think of what in his likeness means, you see this comparison. He put that there for a reason. So the comparison, in the likeness of God made he Adam, and now in Adam's likeness begat he a son. And in verse 2 it says, male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam in the day they were created. And so he's attaching this same sense that as God created Adam, now in his likeness, there's the same thing going on here as we go down the line. So, and now we see, as you see Adam after he'd begotten Seth, after he'd lived 130 years, he lived another 800. And he begat sons and daughters. And he's not saying any other names. He's only mentioning the names that are important for this particular part of the story. And then it says how long he lives. And then Seth lived for a long time, and he begat Enos and lived long. And as we go through it, it's interesting if you apply what those names mean to the story, you can, it's kind of this oral history kind of way of representing a story behind the story. And so you can see this other story coming forth by just the representative names. And you can apply this as you meditate about how life was going for them at that time. And so we see these other people. We've got Enos after, he begat Canaan. And Canaan, we'll see, means possessor or purchaser or smith. And then Canaan begets Mahalalel, which is praise of God. And then he begets Jared, which is conqueror or descent. And Jared begets Enoch. Now here, when we look at Enoch, now we remember that Cain, in his line, had Enoch, and he formed the first city that we have a record of. And Enoch, in this case, means initiated. Now here in this line, we think wonder, and you wonder in your mind, or I encourage you to wonder in your mind, that what was he initiated to? So we talked before in previous chapters that initiated, that there was this, as Lamech became involved in that line, involved in this secret combination kind of thing, mafia type of arrangement. He was initiated into this murder to get gain kind of concept. There's a strong likelihood that we can see in that line that took place. But in here, in this line, it's a completely different kind of initiated kind of person. And we recognize that when we see what Enoch, where he went. He walked with God after he begat Methuselah, which we remember is became the world's oldest man. And we're going to use, he dies and sends out as the prophetic name of Methuselah in this case, and we'll see what his name could mean. So, but initiated in this case was initiated in a completely different sense, to a greater thing. So there's two types of initiations. One towards evil, one towards good. And we see what that means. And so Enoch ends up not dying. God takes him from the earth. And there are also, later in other scriptures, some connotation that there was a different city associated with this Enoch, and that was the city of Zion. But we'll wait for those scriptures before we go into that. Now, Methuselah then begets Lamech. Now Lamech also, in the line of Cain, we remember, now Lamech means poor or made low, and there's two different kinds of what that means. If we remember Lamech in the other line, in Cain's line, he went out and he killed. He was part of this secret combination, and he thought he could get gain from this, and so he was made low in one sense. Now Lamech in this case, we think of, or at least I think of, in the sense that he was a humble man. And, and we see that because as he lives, and he he begets a son. He calls his name Noah, and he has this prophetic statement. When he calls him Noah, he says, "This same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord had cursed." So he's obviously a prophet in this line and this positive thing, and he's seeing things that are good, and he's humble in the sense of, rather than being made low in the sense of the Lamech and Cain's line. So Noah, at the age of 500, specifically, he begets Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now Shem means renown, made a name for himself. Ham means warm or hot, and Japheth means widespreading. Now, if we put all this in a timeline, we can see that on the left side, where paradise was lost, we've started counting the years now. So after they left paradise, Adam and Eve, the people specifically mentioned in this story, we see what their timeline is and how long it takes before the flood comes. And so we know, and we'll see in the next chapter, that 100 years after he begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth, that the flood came. And that's the same year that Methuselah dies. And when we think about that, when Methuselah is dying, we say, well, was Methuselah evil? And clearly he wasn't. And by his name, his line was the projected line, and obviously his son was a prophet making the statement. Noah was a prophet, and it obviously wasn't something that he needed to go on this journey, and he died at least in the year the flood came. So what's in the name? Again, I show you these names and what they mean, and I think that you should ponder about it and come up with the story behind the story and see those things and think about them as how life was and what that represents. Now, I also want to look at this as we look back at the timeline, and we saw 1,656 years from the time that they left paradise until the time that the flood came and killed all the people. And I just look at it and I think, I wonder how many people might have been alive at the time. And so I take this and I start at 2. Adam and Eve were at 2, and you start doubling, and you say, what is a reasonable amount of years or reasonable amount of time before the population doubles? Now you recognize here that these people were living a long time, so there weren't a large number of people dying. I mean, it wasn't a 70, at the age of 70 everybody was dying in this case. Obviously at the beginning the world was in a more pristine setting. We have to assume that. We have to assume that there are a reasonable number of resources available, because they're living to an extraordinary number of years. And as we look at science and say, the amount of time that people live is dependent on the amount of resources that are available, the amount of space, and the things that are happening. So you have to imagine that the number of resources were available were large. And so I'm going to conservatively estimate 50 years. Every 50 years, the population could double. Now, you don't have to believe my 50 years thing, but if that were the case, I put the population at 8,589,934,592 as an approximation. Now, you could go on and you could say, oh, I think they doubled every 20 years, or maybe they doubled every 100 years and reduced that number. But it's just an interesting thing if you think about it, and you think what was going on at the time and why was the Earth in the state it was. And if we look at the population of the planet today, and we see as the population gets to a certain point, things are happening, and situations are arising, and resources come into play, and thinking about what is the state of the world at this time. And it was so bad, obviously, that we're going to find that Noah comes and he has to build the ark. But we'll look at that in chapter 6. So thanks, and we'll see you in the next video.